Hi, all. I hope you're doing well. Thank you so much for joining us for today's briefing entitled Unmasking the Sextortion Crisis Online, a call to action on Safer Internet Day. My name is Coco Lammers, and I work in policy at Childfund International. And in this capacity, I have the honor and privilege of serving as the chair of the End Online Sexual Exploitation and Abuse of Children, or OSEAC Coalition, which is made up of over 35 organizations and lived experience experts working to inform U.S. policy and the U.S. policy space to protect kids online. Before we get started, I want to start with a little bit of a content warning. Please know that today we are going to be discussing topics of extortion, sexual violence, and child abuse. Please take care of yourself and feel free to leave the session if you need to. There are resources available if you or someone you know is looking for support, and they will be added to the chat throughout the session today. I also want to mention that we will have survivors and lived experience experts on the call today, and I hope you will join me in making sure that this space is as comfortable and open as possible for them to facilitate a supportive experience. Okay, so why are we here today? As some of you may know, February 11th marks Safer Internet Day. Safer Internet Day is an annual event celebrated in the US and beyond to promote safer and more responsible use of online technology, particularly among children and young people. It aims to raise awareness about online safety issues and encourage positive digital behavior. I am joined today by a panel of esteemed experts who are going to talk to you about an important topic, sextortion, and specifically how, from their perspectives, the issue of sextortion has harmed children on various technology platforms. Their remarks are reflective of their individual organization's views and not the broader coalition or Childfund's. We will hear from them individually, and then, time pending, we will have some time for questions and answers at the end of the session. We will also have a content moderator in the chat who will help answer questions in real time and collate them for a discussion at the end. If you look on the platform, there should be a Q&A button that you can click in order to access the chat and ask any questions should they come up throughout today's session. To begin, I am welcome to introduce Paul Raphael, an expert on sextortion, and has been working closely with advocacy as an issue area expert who is going to help us better understand the issue of sextortion and why it contributes to a growing number of crimes against children online. Paul, you have the floor. Welcome.
Thank you so much for the introduction, and very happy to be here. We do have a couple slides for this portion of the briefing, so I will wait for those to come up as we go through those. But just by quick background, I've been an Intel analyst my entire career, about 10, 11 years now. Started focusing on financial sextortion as an area about a year and a half ago. Once I started to realize that, hey, this is not just isolated incidents of child exploitation, but actually, in fact, a result of organized crime. Many of these cases that we were seeing in the media and elsewhere were all linked to essentially one criminal group using the same motives on the same platforms, using the same scripts, and it was the same repeated scenario over and over. Are we able to advance to the next slide, please? Perfect. Thank you. All right. So I'm sure at this point, everybody who is on the call probably has a brief background of what financial sextortion is, so I'll just cover this very briefly. Financial sextortion is a crime where criminals are coercing people, usually youth and young people, teens, into sharing intimate photos and videos, and then immediately blackmailing those victims, threatening to leak their photos and ruin their lives unless they continually pay money. So yeah, I think that's the basic definition of financial sextortion at this point. In just a moment, we'll go through why we are focusing on financial sextortion at the moment and why this is so different than other types of child sexual exploitation. It's essentially a scam, it's organized crime, it's a lot of elements compounded together. Next slide, please. And when I mentioned that the criminals threaten not only to leak their photos, but also ruin these kids' lives. There's an entire script, an entire playbook of the threats that they will use to coerce these kids once they have them hooked. Once they have that piece of leverage, a photo plus the kids' contact lists, threatening to send it to all of them, they will also add on additional threats. Your life will be ruined. You're going to lose your scholarship. You are going to get expelled from school. They oftentimes frame the kids as a predator and say that they're going to say that they were sending those photos to a child. Um, Lots of just real heartless, relentless threats that these criminals use once they have the hooks and the blackmail. And unfortunately, this does appear to be one of the reasons why an unfortunate number of teens are choosing to end their lives when they are victimized by this scam. Next slide, please. I'll tell some of those stories here from left to right. Jordan DeMay was a 17-year-old in Michigan. He was contacted one evening on Instagram by somebody pretending to be a girl his age, while in fact it was actually six men from Nigeria using a catfish account in order to coerce Jordan into a compromising situation. As soon as that photo was sent, the blackmail began, just like the you saw on the previous slide. It occurred over the space of about 6 hours. Jordan gave all the money that he had in his online payment platform, and they wanted more. He was found the next morning with a handgun in one hand and his phone last open to Instagram in the other hand. James Woods, another 17-year-old from Ohio, he received over 200 threatening messages in the span of 19 and a half hours before he took his own life. They were demanding, I believe it was $3,000 from James. Gavin Guffey, 17-year-old from South Carolina. After he took his own life, the criminals went on to blackmail his parents, his dad, and his brother for money, or else they would continue to leak the photos to friends and family members. 12 years old, Carson Cleland from Canada. A lot of these platforms, say you have to be 13, but there's no actual verification measure to ensure that is the case. Timothy Barnett was 13. He was sextorted on Snapchat, and he was forced to pay $35 every single day via Cash App until a couple weeks later he took his own life when he ran out of options. Murray Dowie, 16 years old, out of Scotland, was enjoying a regular family evening at Christmas time, watching TV and movies with the family, went up to his room, and it all happened. All of these cases happened in a very short period of time. And the common factor between all these cases, none of these kids had pre-existing suicidal tendencies, mental health issues, depression. In fact, it's the opposite. These are the kids that had everything to lose. These kids had everything going for them. In the last case here, Braden Marcus, on the end, he was contacted on Instagram at 11:01 p.m. He took his own life at 11:28 p.m. One evening. 27 minutes is all it takes. So far, there have been 44 confirmed teen suicides related to this, and I believe that number is way underreported. It is well over 100, in my opinion, at this point. Cases are ending with locked phones, and we just don't know about them. Next slide, please. So I'll give some numbers to this now that we went through some cases of what this actually looks like. Back in 2021, there were only 139 reported cases of financial sextortion targeting minors here in the United States. By 2023, there were 26,000 reported cases that year. That represents an 18,000% increase in the span of 2 years. That is an insane metric. According to data from NCMEC, 90% of these victims are males age 14 to 17. Next slide, please. So the big picture, kind of what I mentioned before, we need to start looking at this like organized crime. It is not just individualized cases. It is a systemic abuse of platform safety gaps and how criminals are able to basically operationalize and scale their abuse on these platforms. This is the largest blackmail operation in human history. It's a public safety emergency. And quite frankly, it has killed more American teens in the past 2 years than ISIS has ever done. Couple more slides here because I want to introduce the next panelists very briefly. So on the next slide, we have a quick overview of the platforms that we're going to be talking about where sextortion, financial sextortion manifests. The next couple of speakers will be presenting about these platforms, and I'll go through them very, very briefly, just at a high level overview. Next slide, please. So we will have a speaker on Meta talking about Instagram. So Instagram is actually the number one platform where criminals are targeting their teens. The reason for this is that the friends and follower list of these victims is the primary source of leverage that these criminals are using to blackmail their victims. Um, Instagram actually does not have a privacy feature to actually keep those specific lists always private. And the moment that a teen accepts that scammer's friend request, those lists are typically exposed. Instagram says they are trying to fix this and put in stopgaps in place, but it's hit or miss at the moment. And very concerning, on Meta's Facebook, sextortion criminals were actually sharing how-to guides um, in public Facebook groups that had, in some groups, over 20,000 members in them, which is abhorrent that they were just sharing this material openly about how to commit this crime and recruiting other criminals to commit this crime with them. Moving on, because I know others will be speaking more about Meta, we have Snapchat. It's actually the number one platform where criminals are coercing the teens to exchange nude images. Um, I want to share very briefly the case of David Gonzalez. He was 15 years old, I believe, out of Utah. Um, he was contacted on Instagram. He refused to send a nude photo there. They moved the chat over to iMessage. He refused to share a nude photo there. And then they finally moved him over to Snapchat. And kids and teens think this is a less risky platform to share material that they might not be willing to do so on other platforms. And that is a great representation of how platforms are using or sorry, how these criminals are abusing the platform safety features to their own benefit. Internal data from Snap in a lawsuit shows that they are handling over 10,000 reports a month, and the internal employees said that likely represents just a small fraction. Moving on. Apple, criminals are specifically using Apple iMessage and iCloud accounts in order to contact their victims. Oftentimes these teens, when they try to block the criminals on Instagram, on Snapchat, uh, they already have the teen's iMessage, their phone number. And this enables the criminals to really harass them across FaceTime, across multiple numbers. They can create more and more iCloud accounts to continually harass that teen at their phone number. And Apple does not appear to have reported any instances of financial sextortion to NCMEC during the past 2 years. And lastly, we will have speakers talking about Cash App. Cash App is the number one payment platform in sextortion crimes talking about youth, or sextortion targeting youth. Its role in sextortion has very rapidly grown to account to nearly 40% of reported cases of financial sextortion where there is a payment made. And we're also aware that Cash App made 0 reports of sextortion to NCMEC in 2023. I do want to say some good news. Some of these platforms have realized the problems that I've mentioned here and are trying to combat it. But right now, we are still seeing sextortion as a very major problem and requires urgent action. So with that said, that wraps up my section. I want to invite the rest of the panelists to dive deep into some of those areas.
Thank you so much, Paul. I really appreciate you kind of setting the scene here about this important topic. And, it really is heartbreaking, especially when you see all these stories and you put a face to a person. And thank you for reiterating that it is a crime, right? Of financial extortion and sextortion, and that these criminals are coercing youth and young people, and that the crime is on the rise, and how important it is to just take time into account here, that time is of the essence. And how often these perpetrators end up making these young people feel like they're alone, when in fact these stories are not unique and they are not alone. And this is just systemic abuse of platform safety, as you mentioned. So thank you so much for providing that context for us today. As Paul mentioned, we are going to really talk about, how this issue is presenting itself from our various speakers' perspectives on various technology platforms, ranging from social media to software and things like that. So with that, I am happy to get to introduce Haley McNamara from NCOSE. She is the Senior Vice President of Strategic Initiatives and Programs. And Haley actually leads joint campaigns within areas of legislation, litigation, and corporate advocacy regarding the full web of sexual exploitation issues. And that advocacy work has contributed to policy improvements in social media, online advertising, retail, and hotel industries. And she regularly speaks and writes on topics including child sexual abuse and sex trafficking. Haley, could you talk a little bit about NCOSE's research and work into exploring Cash App and how this issue appears on that platform? Thank you. Over to you.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Coco. As highlighted today, financial sexual extortion is one of the most dangerous scams, preying on vulnerability of sexual trauma through manipulation and coercion. And this exploitation actually thrives on mainstream digital platforms. And one platform in particular that I'm highlighting today is Cash App. So Cash App is a peer-to-peer payment platform now popular with teens after launching Cash App Teen in 2021. It even eclipses Venmo and PayPal in popularity for teens. And unfortunately, Cash App is riddled with design flaws that allow exploitation to flourish. The ease of bypassing age verification, coupled with weak oversight protocols, has really rendered this platform a dark playground for scammers and predators. And shockingly, a joint report from Thorn and NCMEC revealed that as of August 2023, up to 40% of predator-related chats that they reviewed mentioned Cash App. This app is a major tool for exploiters. So it's helpful to step back and ask, why is that the case? Why is Cash App such a hotbed for sex trafficking and sextortion? And the blame really lies within its design. It's rife with anonymity, instant transactions, and limited accountability. So scammers are easily able to sidestep loose age verification methods that fail to require proper documentation. A couple examples are, although Cash App's policies state that they require users to be at least 13 years of age and verify their account information, our researchers have found that these policies are not routinely enforced. And age verification methods used by Cash App do not require identifying documentation, and they default public-facing profiles, which enables dangerous connections through unrestricted transaction and friend requests. So do you see how obvious and preventable some of these design flaws are? Cash App really can do better, but chooses not to. And research shows that nearly 40 to 75% of reviewed accounts on Cash App are fake or tied to fraudulent behavior. And between 2019 and 2022, Cash App was revealed by the Federal Human Trafficking Report to be the leading payment platform used for extortion and sex buying activity, cited in over 200,000 trafficking-related ads, compared to 24K for Venmo and 130K for PayPal. So these figures are not just numbers, right? They are representing real lives that are being devastated by this unchecked exploitation. Now, there are some positive updates. In 2024, Cash App finally established a new position for an anti-exploitation program manager to try to combat these issues. And they signed a White House commitment document to combat image-based sexual abuse. But so many of these steps seem reactionary, and they do not prevent abuse at mass scale. So the truth is that this crisis would not exist at this scale if proper protections were enforced from the beginning, if we focused on prevention. But current legal frameworks fail to give tech companies incentive to focus on prevention. The Communications Decency Act, Section 230, a relic of outdated legislation, enables big tech harms by allowing these platforms to turn a blind eye to trafficking, grooming, and illegal material because these companies assume that they are shielded with blanket immunity because of this law. And that shield really must be dismantled. The National Center on Sexual Exploitation calls on Congress to sunset CDA 230 in order to ensure that victims have access to justice, predatory platforms are held accountable, and that they're incentivized to do better. And we also implore Congress to pass the Take It Down Act, championed by Senators Cruz and Klobuchar. This vital bill mandates the removal of all instances of image-based sexual abuse within 48 hours of notification from victims. So there is a lot of work to do, but I do believe that mass scale prevention is possible to prevent so many of these tragic cases of financial extortion from the beginning. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Haley. And, it's one of those things too where, an app that is perceived to be used as just kind of a way for, people and especially young people in this case to share money, right? If someone has bought them, a snack when they're out with their friends or something like that, but it's unfortunately being used in different ways. And, I appreciate you sharing some of the ways that, thinking about protections and, the lack of being kind of really thoughtful about some of these protection measures have really allowed some of these issues to flourish on the platform. And I know I've seen a few questions already coming in around sort of, will this be available? Can I watch it later? And the answer is yes, this is being live streamed, so you can watch this later. The resources, we can reshare them. I know some people are really looking for additional resources, so we can reshare them for folks who've been joining later. And I'm really glad, Kelly, you brought up some things on like what people can do. And I know that there have been a few questions already around what can we do. And there actually are a number of pieces of legislation in the works that really are combating this and thinking about this specifically. So thank you so much for bringing up CDA 230 and the Take It Down Act and things like that. And throughout the rest of the session today, you'll likely be hearing about a few other ones. So thanks so much for bringing that into today's discussion. Okay, I get the chance to turn it over now to Harrison, who is going to be sharing the perspective from the End OSEAC Survivors Council, really bringing in kind of that lived experience perspective on this really important issue of sextortion. Harrison, over to you. Thank you for being here.
Yeah, thank you, Coco. I really appreciate the kind introduction. I am super happy to be here. I'm still learning how to present this here. I am filled with gratitude as I get to represent a team of 5 survivors. In this presentation, we will have an anonymous story. If you feel the need to close your eyes or step out, get a drink, it's totally okay. Just be warned, there are some sensitive subjects and topics, and they might hit emotionally home. So we are the End OSEAC Survivors Council. We're covering sexual extortion and Meta's role. The FBI has recently reported a 170% increase in reported cases of sextortion, and that's just reported cases. Many cases go unreported. These reported cases are on Meta's platforms alone. These crimes typically have target populations, teen boys aged 14 to 17, notably teen boys 14 to 17 on specific sports teams, but they can happen to anyone. These crimes are centralized largely in West Africa. However, a predator can look or act like anyone, typically posing as other teens, and we'll learn that through a story later.
Harrison,
Sextortion,
my
yes.
apologies for interrupting, but your slides are not, we can't see your slides moving on
Oh
this.
no, what's happening?
We only see your Canva. Maybe go to presenter view.
Okay, thank you, I appreciate that. How about now?
There we go.
All right, thank you, I appreciate that. See, this is why we're all tech people. Sextortion is an organized crime, and I really appreciate Paul for gathering that information. Oftentimes we think that these are just folks in the fray and in the outskirts of society, but really this is a growing and thriving organized crime with millions of dollars of gathered resources and hundreds of thousands of victims. Research found that coordinated networks of 3,400 accounts on Meta's platforms alone were managed by only 25 individuals. Predators can be seeking financial gain or can demand more sexual photos with varying threats. Threats of dissemination to sports coaches, principals, or family members, or threats of physical harms. I have your IP address. I know which state you're in. I know what school you go to. Or more permanent harms. Last year, at least 20 teen boys aged 14 to 17 committed suicide. They fell prey to sextortion and committed suicide within the first 48 hours of exposure. Meta's role. Meta's network-oriented design and algorithms frequently connect predators to potential victims. Predators can take advantage of teen networks and leverage entire teen communities. And so Meta holds a responsibility to manage reports, promptly remove suspicious accounts, and implement strong prevention measures to protect its users. And let's think about it in the terms of real community spaces. If we imagine schools or parks or sports teams, if the coach or local community members frequently visit these spaces and they're a harm, wouldn't that community also be responsible for making the change? Digital spaces such as Facebook and Instagram should be treated with the same accountability. So we thought of a few cost-effective policy implementations. We thought warning labels, a label upon launch of an application that highlights the risk of exposure to predators and other excessive screen time uses, harmful content, misinformation, etc. This would act as a proactive alert for users, while also allowing Facebook, Meta, Instagram in general to take accountability for their lack of action. We also would implement mandatory safety modules, short modules to educate and remind users of harmful effects of their platforms, notably seeking to educate on red flags of sextortion attempts. And here comes a survivor story. It's a lot of words on a page, so I really would encourage you to close your eyes, take a moment for a deep breath. This is an anonymous story from our friend Jay. My daughter was groomed and sexually exploited on Instagram. In 2021, at the tender age of 12, my daughter got her first phone. She was in school at a sports team and needed to get a hold of us. We knew she wasn't ready for social media and she was not allowed to have access to it. Shortly after getting that phone, we noticed her grades started to slip. She became angry and began to withdraw from the sports and activities that she had once loved. We thought maybe it was just a regular old teen angst, but one horrible day we found out what was actually happening. My daughter had done something very normal for kids her age. She pushed back against her parents' boundaries and created an Instagram account so she could see reels that her friends would send her. That fear of missing out was real, and it makes parenting harder than it already is. While she was on Instagram, a sexual predator had found her and pretended to be a teenager her age, interested in her romantically. He convinced her to share explicit photos and videos of herself, and as soon as she did, the blackmail all started. For more than a month, he coerced her into sending more and more images, telling her that he knew where she lived, threatening to kill her friends or family if she didn't follow his instructions. He even coerced her into giving him the password and access to her account so he could use her profile, photos, and images to lure and exploit other kids. This experience left her feeling humiliated and terrified, afraid to even leave the house. We tried to report the abuse to Instagram, but she used a fake birth year to sign up for her account. And when we changed it to her real birth year, Instagram blocked our account. We never got the chance to report it. We reported it to NCMEC, the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children, Homeland Security, and our local police department. The IP addresses used were from overseas and nothing could be done. Those predators are still out there, and so are those images. God knows how many more victims there are. Her mental health is still struggling, but she's a better person than she was 4 years ago. I decided to share our story and advocate for online safety for kids because it's not okay that Instagram allowed a criminal to find a 12-year-old girl almost as soon as she started her account on the platform, pretend to be someone else, and systemically coerce her into sharing these videos. His strategy of using her profile to lure more victims is especially chilling, evoking the image of an ever-expanding digital spiderweb that caches unsuspecting children. Instagram makes billions of dollars from kids like my daughter using their platform, and they owe our kids better. I hope our story can help inform other families about these terrible risks, especially to those who think they're on the top of social media's boundaries. I think it's really important to acknowledge the fact that that particular predator gathered her information. Like I said before, these predators can often leverage teen networks. And I'm sure in that story, he contacted their friends, their community members. And so we gathered survivor advice. These situations can be really difficult. In moments of anxiety or fear, anger, we don't often make, well, the best choices. So throughout our survivor community, we gathered 5 pieces of advice. We recommend that you would report the predator's account immediately on whatever platform you're on, specifically Instagram or Facebook, and block all potential methods of contact through the messaging platform or through your private phone number or email. We would recommend that you save every piece of information, their profile, their messages, their username, and even photos that you may have sent for law enforcement. These photos and videos are vital to capturing and holding these predators accountable. We'd also recommend that you contact the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children. Cooperating with the predator's demands rarely ends harassment, but law enforcement can help. Here are additional resources. Like I said before, contacting NCMEC, the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children. We have 2 links from their page, missingkids.org, report@cybertipline.org. And for more prevention measures, visit dhs.gov, know how to protect. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Harrison, for sharing that perspective on Meta, specifically giving more information on steps that can be taken in terms of prevention and response. And thank you also, Jay, for bravely bringing in their story. And it really helps bring the reality of the situation to light, and also how kind of law enforcement plays a role in this, in tackling some of these crimes. Thank you so much for being here. Okay, so we're going to move it along a little bit to another platform, Snapchat. And I get to introduce Shelby Knox, who is a campaign and impact strategist at Parents Together, with a background leading digital and film-centered social justice campaigns. Parents Together is going to share a bit about the prevalence of sextortion on Snapchat. Shelby, over to you. Thank you for being here.
Thank you so much, Coco. According to data from the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children, Snapchat is one of the largest platforms that enables the sextortion of children. For those of us who study safe tech design, that's not a surprise. If you're not familiar with Snapchat, the core function is that it allows users to send photos and videos to each other that disappear after they've been viewed. Snapchat also uses algorithms to recommend friends and content to users, photo filters and other modifications, and allows users to share their location on a map. Yes, the parents' dreaded Snap Map. But it's Snapchat's central design feature, the disappearing messages, that create a unique opportunity for predators and criminals to thrive on the platform, and a unique challenge for parents to keep kids safe. But it's not just Snapchat's design that's created a huge sextortion problem on the site. Internal documents from Snapchat released as part of a lawsuit last fall show that Snapchat has created a haven for sexual predators and sextortionists by intentionally and systematically ignoring more than 10,000 user reports of sextortion every month. That's right. They were ignoring more than 10,000 user reports of sextortion every month. Massive numbers of users were reporting sextortion, despite, as employees said, it was not easy to categorize in their reporting system. One internal communication even admitted, this is a quote, "By design, over 90% of account level reports are ignored today. And instead, we just prompt the person to block the other person." To be clear, that is sometimes telling a child to block the person who is sexually exploiting them. Snapchat also learned from internal research that more than a third of teens on Snapchat reported receiving unwanted contact, and 51% of Gen Zers reported they or a friend has been catfished on the platform. So what did Snap do with this knowledge? First, they continued to invest in platform features to keep kids on the app for longer. Then they spent millions of dollars fighting regulation and trying to convince parents that they aren't like other social media companies. They're safe for kids. They even bought a Super Bowl ad last year aimed at convincing parents and kids that they aren't really a social media company. The result of this decision to put profits over kids' safety and well-being is real harm to real kids and families. Here are what some of the parents we work with had to say about their children's experiences on Snapchat. A content warning, because some of these contents do deal with sexual abuse and suicide. Deborah from Virginia said, "My son was tricked into sending an inappropriate picture and then was blackmailed into sending money. I was one of the lucky parents as he came to me and we talked about it. It's disgusting that these huge platforms don't do more to keep kids safe." Hannah from California said, "My 16-year-old niece was asked to share topless nudes through Snapchat, and then she was extorted to send money, or the photos would be sent to her school and to her loved ones. It was terrifying." Tammy from Connecticut said, "My daughter took her own life due to exploitation through Snapchat. She posted a video of herself on Snapchat taking the pills." Deborah, Hannah, and Tammy live in different states, come from different backgrounds, and have different political views. But their families have all been harmed by Snapchat's failures to protect children from this horrific crime. Sextortion is an industry-wide problem that needs an industry-wide solution. We need lawmakers to regulate social media companies. Snapchat's decision to focus on selling kids and parents a story of safety rather than making actual changes to make their platform actually safer is exactly why we need this regulation now. Parents are not sitting by and waiting for action because the longer these platforms go unregulated, the more kids die. Parents whose kids have been harmed online spent the last 2 years working to win passage of the Kids Online Safety Act, which passed out of the Senate with 91 votes before failing to progress before the end of the year. Parents in states from New Mexico to Nebraska to South Carolina to New York are pushing for safety by design bills that require social media platforms to set children's accounts to the most private by default and allow parents and kids more control over the algorithms that keep kids coming back over and over again in the first place. No other product that harmed this many kids would be allowed to stay on the shelves. Its maker would be put out of business. It's time for all of our elected representatives to step up to prevent more kids from becoming victims.
Thank you so much, Shelby, for those powerful words and for also bringing in the parents' perspective around this. And not only are these parents who have had these horrible things, happen to their children, these parents are also out there advocating for change. They are taking time out of their busy lives to try to make sure that this doesn't happen to kids in the future. And thank you also for bringing in just a little bit of the discussion around the role of technology companies and how oftentimes they're turning a blind eye to these issues or actively working against progress on these issues, even when they've been brought to their attention. So thank you so much for bringing that in today. Oftentimes when we talk about this issue, or hear about issues like this, social media platforms come up. And the reality is that this actually happens on a variety of platforms. We've heard about financial platforms, right? We've heard about social media platforms. We're also going to talk a little bit about OS platforms, operating software platforms, and how that kind of comes into effect. So I'm happy to introduce Sarah Gardner, who is the founder and CEO of the HEAT Initiative, where she's bringing the direct action and corporate campaigning muscle to the child safety space. Her expertise in preventing tech-facilitated child sexual abuse has positioned her in the HEAT Initiative to effectively pressure companies directly to prioritize the safety of our most vulnerable, our children. Today, Sarah will highlight a less obvious player in the crisis of sextortion, Apple. Sarah, over to you.
Thank you so much. And I'm so proud to be part of this group today and hear from such esteemed colleagues who know so much about this crime. I actually want to pick up kind of where Shelby and Coco have left off and very, very briefly talk about Apple. And I should say I'm the CEO of the HEAT Initiative. As Coco mentioned, our job is to put pressure on these companies to change these policies now. And how do we create that groundswell and pressure? And I do want to talk about Apple, but what I actually want to spend my time on, because we have such little time, is why aren't these things changing? And why aren't these companies making these changes now? Paul, you started with that slide of those 8 faces. That should be enough. And my guess is for everyone on this call, one life is enough. That's why we're all here. But when is it enough lives that these companies care? Because they are rationalizing this harm on the platforms by saying it is a small portion of what's happening to kids. And we don't need a child to die for it to count. We need to demonstrate that all kids that are on any of these platforms are immediately at risk for sextortion. Every single one of them. It doesn't need to happen to them for it to become a problem. So I'm all riled up because we have the data that makes these cases. What we need to start looking at are the business incentives and why these things are not changing. And the note on Apple is iMessage is if a messaging platform that connects kids to adults. And so just like you've heard the way it manifests on in other environments, the same realities and environment are then true in iMessage. Therefore, kids need an ability to report when sextortion is happening then in iMessage, and that is not available to them now. So there is even less protections in iMessage than there are really on any of the platforms mentioned. And that extends to other encrypted platforms like WhatsApp and Telegram. You can report when something is happening to you. So Apple needs to get in the arena and make sure that reporting is available to kids across the globe. Just to go back and just a final note on this, because I know we're running out of time and I want people to be able to ask questions. We look at what are the business incentives, how are companies making this decision to really prioritize this and make these changes or not? And the reality is that it unfortunately all comes down to stock price and brand damage. And right now they are outlasting us in the media because we are still small. We are not a big enough problem for them yet as a movement. And so I'm so pleased to see every single number of the participants today at the bottom, because we have to become a bigger problem for them, for this to rise up in their list of priorities and realize this is something we actually need to address right now, or we're going to have a major problem where we have users or advertisers fleeing from our platform. And so I'm so grateful to all of you who are here to hear this message. And I love the questions about the legislation and what are other ways that we can continue to get the message out there and really shame these companies for the allowing sextortion to be happening like this at such a scale in 2025. It's just absolutely inexcusable. So sorry to take my comments a different direction, but that is, after you see those presentations, how can you not be fired up and ready to take action? So I hand it back over to you, Coco, to help us distill where we should go from here. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sarah, and for bringing in that sort of call to action that we need in this, right? These are just a few perspectives that have been brought in. And, for me, it's hard to come away not feeling like, oh my gosh, what can I do, right? What do I need to do? How can I help? And I'm really glad that the legislation has been brought in. And I know we have some offices and staffers on the line here today. Thank you so much for joining. And, I would just encourage you all to keep an eye out for some of the internet safety bills that are coming up this year, including, the Take It Down Act, SHIELD. There was mention of CDA 230, Kids Online Safety Act, and also funding for critical kids safety and child safety accounts. I get the pleasure of working with organizations like these on this panel to do advocacy on these, but also that include law enforcement groups, survivors groups, child-focused groups, and others. And I can tell you we're all so committed to continuing in this fight, but it's not easy and we can't go it alone. And, I'm sure that this group will join me in saying that, there are resources. We're happy to continue to share and continue to talk as many times as we need to kind of ultimately get to the change that we need to see. Paul, before we open it up into the question and answers, as our sort of issue area expert on this, I wanted to just get your reflections on the panel here today. What do you think, what are your takeaways from here following some of these accounts and some of the research that's been done?
Yeah, a lot of great takeaways. Very, very happy to sit with these panelists, and also very excited for the Q&A to come afterwards. So feel free to put any questions in the chat. The biggest takeaway for me, I think, is we've established that the criminals who are doing this are organized, and this is, an at-scale crime. We've established that the platforms are organized pretty much against any regulation. They are all in favor of self-regulating for their own financial purposes. And that demands that, we have to be organized. If the criminals and the platforms are organized, we have to be too. So that's why I'm very appreciative, like Sarah mentioned, as individuals and as individual organizations here, we're fragmented, but panels like this and getting everybody together on this sort of topic is a good way for us to be force multipliers and get organized together against this. So that's my takeaway, and happy to turn it over to the Q&A.
Thank you so much, Paul. Really appreciate that. And yeah, couldn't agree more on some of this. So I really appreciate everyone for joining today. I appreciate the fact that we have participants from around the world joining and bringing in their perspectives. And I've also had the chance to look a little bit at the Q&A, and there have been some incredible questions that have come through. And so what I'm going to go ahead and do is summarize a few of them, share them with you all, and invite each of the panelists to take one that they feel like fits and they can respond to. And then if we have time, we can get through some other ones. I know there have been some really specific questions about follow-up and can we use resources and things like that following that. And I'm sure that my colleagues at NCOSE here will help make sure that people have the information that they need moving forward at the end of the session. So, and I just want to acknowledge too that there have been quite a number of disclosures directly in the Q&A. And so I want to thank those folks for bringing in their reports, and just so sorry that that happened to you. And just know that, we're all here to create an environment that we know that this is not an isolated occurrence. This happens, unfortunately, quite frequently. And again, there are resources if you would like some additional support. But so this also leads me to another question which came up, which is sort of beyond just the legislation, which I will argue is important. So just note that, right? How can survivors and advocates get involved? What are some concrete things that folks can do? We know that there were a few examples shared. I'm going to share a few other questions here. How can platforms be held accountable? And I think for me, I would say that that's where some of the legislation comes in, but others may have other thoughts on that as well. We've also had some questions around what are some proactive prevention measures. Harrison, I know you brought up something specifically on Meta that could be brought in. There may be some other things that folks can think about in the prevention side of things. And then how are some of the safety updates that technology companies have implemented around this been working or not? I know we've had a few comments around that. And then we've also had some questions around the role that law enforcement can play. There was also a very specific question about the Apple lawsuit on why they did not take CSAM off of their platforms. So I will just kindly start maybe with Haley, and then Harrison, Shelby, Sarah, to kind of go in that order and kind of answer a question. Or if I didn't share one that you feel like speaks to what you want to talk about, the floor is yours. Haley, over to you.
Thank you so much, Coco. Yeah, speaking on holding the platforms accountable, that is where I would really look. I do think that is a legislative issue that we need to address in our country. As I mentioned, Communications Decency Act Section 230 is a significant contributor to the lack of incentive right now for platforms to be held liable and for civil litigation. I think civil litigation is another way that we can hold platforms accountable, but very often they're shielded in courts by the CDA 230. There is a law called FOSTA SESTA, which passed, which does work to open the door for civil litigation for survivors in cases of platforms knowingly facilitating commercial sexual exploitation. Unfortunately, very few, I believe, and I speak under correction, none of those cases have been won in the court system yet because of judges leaning back on Communications Decency Act Section 230, which they're interpreting to give far broader immunity than the law ever called for. And I just want to say that these platforms do need to be held accountable and have an incentive to prevent this kind of abuse, because there are really simple design things that they can do better, such as not allowing strangers to direct message children. So many platforms still allow that to happen. So that's just one example of when a platform is actually forced to think about prevention, they can easily start finding holes in their systems in order to prevent these kinds of harms from being facilitated at such a mass scale.
Thanks, Haley. Shelby, did you have a question you wanted to respond to?
Sure. So I am going to put into the chat to be shared later some scripts that we have for talking to your kids about sextortion and some prevention tips. I wanted to address some of the steps that companies have taken to address sextortion, which at least in the case of Meta, so far they rolled out teen accounts with all sorts of promises, as well as said that they were directly taking on sextortion. And the problem with a lot of these solutions is that they require a vulnerable child who is in the process of being exploited by an adult criminal to intervene in their own exploitation. So to have the presence of mind to know they're being exploited, to know how to report, to know what to do. And any solution that puts the onus back on the user or back on the parent is a tech company shirking their responsibility to keep their most vulnerable users safe on their platforms. So when you look at any tool that anyone comes out with to protect kids, to prevent sextortion, to prevent any sort of crime, does it put the onus on the user, the person who is potentially being exploited? If so, that's not a safety tool, that's a PR move for the company.
Thanks, Shelby. Yeah, noted and really strong point there. Harrison, anything on your end that you wanted to respond to?
Yeah, I saw a particular question. As a survivor, how can I get involved? I think there are tons of ways you can get involved as a survivor. I think if we gather our voices on the platforms where our exploitation occurred, using particular programs that are already available. I saw Nikki Riesberg in the chat, Donna Rice Hughes in the chat. If we can share our stories and empower our communities to also open up about things that are occurring. I know when I shared my story live with Sarah Gardner and the Heat team last year, there were dozens of community members, even members of my family, who shared the fact that they had also had abuse online. These people began to step into lobbying roles and activism, gathering with some of the organizations that are present today. So I think it just starts with sharing your voice on the platforms where your abuse might have occurred, or maybe just starting having a conversation. If you've never shared your story, maybe finding a trusted peer or community member, leader, or advocate to share your story with. Yeah, I think it all starts really small.
Thanks, Harrison. Sarah, anything that you want to respond to?
Yeah, I really appreciate you mentioning that, Harrison. And I do think this is a time where we can take a playbook from other moments where activists have had to go up against really powerful industries that have a ton of resources, power, and money, right? And the good news is that there are ways to get companies to change their policies and their practices now that then need to be memorialized in legislation. So going back to that point, we need both, right? But sometimes we can't wait the amount of time it takes to pass legislation. We need some of these things now, and that can look like taking direct actions, showing up in person in real life to demonstrate to a company that you are willing to take that step is a pretty big and powerful step one can take. Companies do not like being surprised. They know how to sort of fight stuff that is happening online, but sometimes if you're showing up in person, it's coming out of left field and they're not prepared, and it can create a really, damaging media moment for them. That's just one tactic we can take as a movement. Paul mentioned being organized, so providing those opportunities. And I think it's going to be kind of a time for us to think about not just survivors, but those who are advocates in the space. Like, what risks can we take? Because I feel like oftentimes we ask survivors to be taking a lot of the risk of sharing stories and so forth. And when people are ready, that is an incredible step to take. But the rest of us, what are we willing to put at stake in this fight now, on behalf of the survivors and survivor parents that we work with and know and hold dear in our hearts? So I think it is a really interesting moment for self-reflection. And the other thing I was going to mention is, there is an incredible amount of litigation now happening in this space. And there's so many of us on this call are connected into that litigation. And so for survivors, making sure that you have all the information, if there are class action lawsuits that are on your behalf, like knowing where to go and finding those resources, because litigation is also a tool where if we can win some of these cases, these companies may change the policies now because the financial burden of having that kind of exposure is too high. So just two things to mention.
Thanks, Sarah. Paul, was there a question that you wanted to respond to? I also saw a question that recently that was about what can researchers and academics do to support this? So I don't know if you have any thoughts around that too.
Oh, that's such a good question. And I don't know if I have a good answer to that one. I've been very fortunate because after my research came out, kind of one of the first pieces about financial sextortion and how it's all linked and connected together. I know that a number of university professors and research labs have started to incorporate and actually like run research projects on this and track this activity. So I guess my advice for anyone interested in that is to search for some of those opportunities, other professors, other academic institutions that have just recently also started to do this work too. I think that's a good opportunity to network with them and partner up.
Thank you so much. It's such a tangible thing too, which is so great. Sometimes some of these things feel big, and this is like a granular thing that folks can do. So I'll kind of take it here. We had so many questions. I wish we had time to answer all of them, and we don't. And honestly, I think a lot of this is more just wanting to continue the conversation. I've seen some people add in some additional links talking about state level legislation that's active and people are working on, talking about connections to trafficking, talking about connections to other countries and what happens in law enforcement and all of that. And I think, hopefully this webinar in a small way has helped understand, and all of us, I know I've learned a lot too about how immediate this crisis is, how we do need to come together to figure out how to solve this. There is legislation at the federal level and the state level actively being worked on this right now, and we encourage all of the offices that are on this call to kind of take this seriously. We know that there's litigation, right? That's in play right now. Follow those, see what happens. Reach out, right? Even at the local level. And Harrison mentions too, it starts small, right? Having those conversations, not being afraid to broach this topic because it is something that unfortunately is pervasive. The crime is on the rise, and we all have to come together to address this. So with that, I want to wind down today's briefing with a note around the need for collaboration between lived experience experts, civil society, technology companies, law enforcement, policymakers, parents, supporters, everyone who wants to be involved to create a safer online environment for children. And we really look forward to continuing to engage with you around how best to do that and how best we can protect kids online by ending sextortion on these various platforms and beyond. I also really want to thank our insightful panel for their critical remarks today. And specifically, I want to call out Megan from NCOSE for their incredible work in helping to pull this together, and the team at NCOSE for helping to host this wonderful session today, this webinar. Thank you so much for being here, and take care. And we look forward to continuing the conversation. More resources will be followed after this. Thank you so much. Be well.